Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Louisiana. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The first mention of the man now known only as the vanished planter appears in an 1854 entry of the Iberville Parish land registry. The handwriting is cramped and slightly uneven, as if the clerk, Thomas J. Keller, wrote it in haste. Transfer of Cane Hollow estate from James A. LaRue to estate proxy, pending verification of death certificate. Yet no death certificate was ever filed. The property, nearly 600 acres of sugarcane fields, 2 weathered mills and a main house overlooking the Mississippi, stood quiet for months after the supposed death. The neighboring plantations, like those once run by the Amie family nearby, carried on with their harvests. In letters later found in the Keller archives, one clerk wrote, "It's a curious business. LaRue's will filed but his grave unmarked. Widow seen but no mourning veil." Locals recalled James LaRue as an intelligent but increasingly erratic man. A decade before his disappearance, he was respected in company with Valcour Aimé himself, the so-called Sugar King of Louisiana. Both men invested heavily in new refining methods and competed for regional prestige. But while Aimé was admired for his philanthropy, LaRue was whispered to be cruel, more interested in legacy than compassion. He married late, his wife Eleanor said to be frail and pale as the sugar bloom itself. They had no children. Around 1850, LaRue began speaking obsessively of lineage, of preserving the LaRue name no matter the cost. In November of 1853, a riverboat captain swore he saw a body pulled from the shallows near Bayou Gula. The man was dressed in a torn waistcoat, resembling LaRue's, though decomposition made identification impossible. Within days, Eleanor declared her husband dead from an apparent accident. His affairs quickly transferred to a mysterious proxy from Baton Rouge, but a month later, a field hand named Cyrus reported seeing Mr. James in the cane rows at dusk, watching silently before slipping into the fog. Other workers told of food missing from the smokehouse and fresh boot prints in the wet soil behind the sugar mill. A traveling surveyor, Henry Doss, later noted in his journal that the Cane Hollow property looked neither alive nor dead, a place under watch by something unfinished. The mills were idle, the workers restless, the main house shuttered except for one lit window at night. Doss mentioned a young man working the fields alone, strong and dark-skinned, with a scar across his cheek and a strange resemblance to the late master. He wrote, "It is as though a ghost labors to keep the land breathing." When constables were asked to investigate in 1855, they found no record of LaRue's body nor his burial. Only Eleanor remained, claiming her husband's spirit haunted her for neglecting his wishes. She died a year later, found seated at her writing desk, a half-finished letter before her that read simply, "He lives under my name." By 1856, whispers around Bayou Gula had grown into a steady rumor. Locals said the man buried without a grave was not buried at all, and that his widow's estate showed signs of quiet occupation. Parish constables made note of lamplight seen at strange hours and deliveries to an absent owner. The ledgers were signed by a hand that matched LaRue's, but slightly altered. The letters taller, as if someone were imitating him. Field workers, many freed or sold off after Eleanor's death, described a tall, gaunt man occasionally appearing near the sugar mill, wearing LaRue's coat, his face gaunt but unmistakable. The resemblance unsettled even the foreman, who later told a visiting merchant, either that man faked his death or the devil learned to write. An 1857 inquiry by Justice Malcolm T. Reeves confirmed discrepancies in the estate's management. Reeves compared them with records from Valcour Aimé's nearby plantation to assess production loss. Both estates showed similar sugar yields, despite LaRue's supposed death. Reeves wrote, "No dead man grows such profits." He ordered another search, but the deputies returned empty-handed. Instead, they found an outbuilding at the edge of the property, a single-room shanty filled with papers, an empty bottle of laudanum, and a crude cot. A ledger inside bore 2 sets of handwriting, one shaky and old, another bolder, almost a mimic. The final page read, "Name continues. He will bear it, as arranged." The meaning was uncertain until a decade later when an overseer named Jonah Clark gave testimony before the parish magistrate. Clark described how after the widow's funeral, a young slave named Caleb had been removed from the estate's ledger, erased, like he'd never existed. Clark remembered LaRue calling Caleb the mirror. Caleb, according to him, bore a striking resemblance to his master. Same jawline, same light eyes, though darker skin. He'd been favored, given education, fine clothing, and visits from a doctor whose tools were for no wound I could see. The doctor's name appeared in the margins of an 1852 account book. Dr. R. Montfort, Special Service, 3 nights. Invoices vanished soon after. The rumors took on a darker shape by 1860. Locals told of a man seen rowing across the bayou under the name James Rone. He matched LaRue's height, wore the same ring, and traveled with a younger man of mixed complexion. A steamboat manifest from Baton Rouge to New Orleans lists J. Rone and Son. Departing the same week, an unmarked grave near Cane Hollow was disturbed by scavengers. The sheriff closed the report without further comment. By the eve of the Civil War, both men had disappeared entirely. Only a single photograph, faded, daguerreotype style, remained in an auction ledger decades later, labeled Cane Hollow, 1850s. It showed 2 men beside a carriage, one older, severe, the other standing behind him with eyes that did not look away. In 1863, during the chaos that spread across Louisiana as Union troops advanced, an officer from the 21st Indiana Infantry noted in his journal a curious encounter while requisitioning property near Plaquemine. He wrote that an old plantation, believed abandoned since before the war, showed signs of occupation by 2 men, one sickly, one strong. The house was shuttered, but smoke rose from its chimney. When the soldiers approached, they found a workbench covered with glass vials and scalpels. The younger man claimed to be a servant tending to his dying father, who he said was James Rone. The officer left them undisturbed, noting only that the son's eyes were grey, uncommonly so. The name Rone would appear again in later census fragments, though the ages and origins never matched. One record lists a J. Rone planter, born 1798. The next a Caleb Rone, mulatto, born 1840, literate, occupation, overseer. Parish records suggest both resided in the same general district, once controlled by the LaRue estate. None of their papers survived the courthouse fire of 1882. The resemblance to Valcour Amy's own legacy lingered in the margins, 2 planters' lines, both marked by wealth, secrecy, and sudden disappearance. Local historians comparing the estates would later write that the LaRue case was a mirror in the dark, a reflection of what power could buy when death itself became negotiable. A few surviving testimonies deepened that sense of unease. In 1871, a carpenter named Thomas Brinley, working to repair a collapsed storage wing at what was once Cane Hollow, found beneath the floor a shallow pit lined with lime and straw. In it lay a broken locket containing 2 miniatures, one unmistakably Eleanor LaRue, the other half burned, its face scratched away. Nearby were fragments of a journal page, sealed in a wax envelope. The words were faint, but Brinley swore they read, "He bears the name and I his likeness." The parish constable dismissed the find as forgery. The fragments disappeared during transfer to the courthouse. Brinley died of fever that winter, leaving only a letter describing the discovery. Some say the area workers refused to go near the site afterward, claiming they heard voices at dusk. Soft, rehearsed, like a man whispering his own name again and again. In 1884, a professor from Baton Rouge, Dr. Henry Alcott, gathered oral accounts for a survey on Louisiana folklore. Among the entries was the man who lived twice, clearly based on the LaRue story. One elderly woman, believed to have been a housemaid at Cane Hollow, claimed she saw 2 masters, one in daylight, one after dark, both bearing the same scar beneath the eye. She told Alcott, "He wanted his name to live, but he forgot that names are heavier than blood." By 1886, the legend had already outgrown the record. Parish clerks spoke of it quietly, an oddity folded between floods, fires, and boundary disputes. Yet in the archives of St. James Parish, a single letter surfaced that reignited the whispers. It was written by Reverend Samuel Breck, a circuit preacher who'd traveled through the sugar parishes during Reconstruction. He described visiting a small homestead of fine but faded structure, where he was summoned to deliver last rites to a gentleman planter gravely ill, identified as James Rone. Breck noted the man's refined speech, his distinct pallor, and eyes that reflected two ages at once, youth unclaimed by the body that bore it. In a postscript, Breck wrote, "He confessed not sin but succession." When Breck's letter was reviewed decades later by a historian from Tulane, it drew parallels to the curious family practices of Valcour Aimé, Louisiana's renowned sugar baron, who meticulously documented every experiment, every inheritance, every moral trial of the age. Aime's plantation journals hinted that his peers, including a Mr. J. LaRue of the Western Bend, sought methods to ensure their names would not die with their bodies. To Aimé it was social legacy. To LaRue, it seemed to have turned literal. The last confirmed trace of the Roane family appears in 1890, when an undertaker's ledger in New Orleans lists burial arrangements for a Caleb J. Rone mixed race age 50, occupation clerk. The purchaser of the grave was J. A. Rone, no relation recorded. When the undertaker was later questioned about the name, he admitted the older man had paid in gold, refusing to sign any document. He described him as white, but with something foreign in his speech and eyes pale as glass. The grave, like so many others from that year, was never marked. The cemetery flooded 2 seasons later, its records dissolved in mud. The 1893 hurricane carried away what remained of Cane Hollow's boundaries. The house collapsed, its bricks scattered into the cane fields. Only the shanty by the levee survived, a single wall and iron cot visible at low tide. A farmer who bought the land afterward said his workers refused to plough that corner. He told a journalist in 1895, "They say a man still waits there, coat and hat set proper, staring down river. They call him the Watcher." When modern archivists attempt to reconstruct the LaRue file, they find fragments, letters without envelopes, birth records struck through, a wax seal depicting a cane stalk entwined with an eye. The Parish Museum keeps a single surviving page from Breck's original letter under glass. The last line, nearly illegible, reads, "He could not outlive himself, yet he walked away." In 1896, the LaRue name resurfaced in an unexpected place, a property sale in Natchez, Mississippi. The deed listed the seller as James A. Rone, with handwriting that county officials described as archaic but steady. The buyer never met him directly. Correspondence arrived through an agent, sealed in wax depicting a sugarcane stalk twisted into an eye. A notary later remarked that the signature bore a resemblance to one seen in Iberville 40 years prior. When compared with estate documents preserved from the days of Valcour Ames plantation transactions, the penmanship and phrasing showed uncanny similarity. Yet there was no way to prove it. By then, Louisiana's pre-war registers had been scattered by flood and fire. Only one personal letter from the sale survived. It was addressed to a Mr. Montfort, possibly the same physician once hired by LaRue. It read, "The line holds. He carries it with the strength of 2. The phrasing was clinical, detached, almost as if written by a man observing his own experiment. The recipient was never located. Oral tradition around Natchez spoke of a light seen on the Mississippi bluffs that year, where a white-haired gentleman and a colored man built fires and spoke no word. Some accounts claim that after the 1898 flood, remains of an old carriage were found half buried near St. Gabriel, its wood warped and its seat cushions shredded by time. Inside was a single ivory button and a folded page from a travel ledger listing Rone. J.A. Return passage cancelled. The riverboat captain who found it turned the items over to local authorities, but the evidence vanished before cataloguing. By the turn of the century, Cane Hollow had become nothing more than overgrown fields and the shell of a foundation. Locals avoided it, calling it the Parish of 2 names. Those who wandered near reported odd details. A fence that appeared newly mended, though the nearest farm was miles away, footprints in the mud leading nowhere, and faint whistling heard at dusk. Parish archivist Ellen Dufresne, who compiled local oral histories in 1903, wrote, "The LaRue case is remembered only in hush. They say a man fled death to master it, and that his heir was not born but made." Her notes are now stored in the State Library, brittle and incomplete. In the margins of one page, she wrote something she later crossed out. The eye in the cane was meant to see itself. No official marker ever stood on the site, though fragments of a gate hinge and a rusted signpost are sometimes found after storms. Even today, farmers speak of unease when ploughing near the old levee. They say the ground there shifts more than anywhere else, as though unsettled by something beneath it, or someone still moving within its name. In 1904, the state surveyors sent to map the new levee system encountered what one report called a remnant, dwelling of notable precision. It was the last traceable structure from the former Cane Hollow. Property, a square foundation, cellar intact, filled with relics that didn't belong to the age. Among the debris was a framed portrait blackened by soot. 2 men captured beside a carriage, the image faint but unmistakably deliberate. The inspector, C. Langdon, noted that the glass plate was dated 1856 by its maker's mark and bore a faint inscription etched into the backing, "Name endures." That photograph, kept briefly in the Iberville courthouse, vanished after an archivist's death in 1907. Langdon's written description, however, remained on file and mentioned that one figure appeared younger, darker, and watching the other with unnatural likeness. Langdon's assistant, Joseph Rone, gave a more unsettling account in his personal diary. He claimed the cellar walls bore scratches forming what looked like half-finished words. Roa, or perhaps Rue. He wrote, "We left before sundown as the light behaved wrong against the dust. It was as if something shone back. When questioned later, he insisted the house smelled faintly of laudanum and oil, though both substances should have long evaporated by then. By that point, even the oldest residents of the parish had only second-hand tales. One elderly woman, identified in parish census notes as Rebecca Montfort, the daughter of Dr. Montfort, who had once treated James LaRue, told interviewers that her father used to say, "A man can inherit his own face if he wills it so." When pressed, she refused to elaborate. She died the following year, leaving no family. The grave marker read simply, "Witness." References to Valcour Aimé's estate continued to shadow the case. Scholars at Tulane, who catalogued Aimé's surviving plantation journals, remarked on one odd entry from the early 1850s, mentioning an associate of peculiar ambition near Iberville, attempting creation of self through substitution. Though Aimé's tone was detached, the phrasing matched later accounts of LaRue's obsession with legacy. The university's review concluded that Aimé's journals were less about moral decay than an observation of what happens when identity becomes property. A brief surge of public interest in 1910 brought newspaper writers from Baton Rouge to the ruins. They found little beyond the collapsed cellar and a scatter of iron nails, but their reports carried an uneasy tone. One article in the Morning Advocate described the area as eerily preserved in its decay, the soil around the foundation strangely soft. Locals refused to rebuild there, saying, "That land don't keep what's buried." When the levee works resumed 2 years later, the engineers filled the remaining cellar with gravel. They marked it on the maps only as subsidence zone, avoid grading. After that, Cane Hollow vanished from official records once again, leaving behind a legend that had already begun to turn into folklore, the planter who refused to die, and the face that followed him wherever he fled. By 1912, when the federal engineers finally sealed the lower levee, they unearthed a few last remnants, bones, tools, and something resembling a doctor's satchel. The men who found it were ordered to hand the contents to the parish clerk, but one foreman, Albert Green, later admitted he kept a folded page for himself. It was a letter addressed simply to "my inheritor." The handwriting was spidery and deliberate. "The body yields as soil does. Tend it with patience and the name will rise again." Green swore he returned the paper when rumors began to spread that the worksite was cursed, but the clerk found nothing. The bag itself contained rusted instruments, a glass syringe, and an ivory-handled knife etched with initials, JLR. A short article appeared that spring in the Plaquemine Post, quoting county historian Ellen Dufresne, who said the find confirms the persistence of myth within record, where one man's fear of oblivion became another's inheritance. Her calm phrasing could not hide the unease behind it. She had once compared the case to the meticulous notes of Valcour Aimé, reminding readers that ambition, when left without conscience, tends to turn back upon itself. After that piece ran, Dufresne received an unsigned envelope containing a photograph, a blurred image of the same farmhouse ruin taken from across the levee. On its back, someone had written, "Still occupied." No one came forward to claim it, and the photo disappeared from her files after a brief mention in her private correspondence. Her assistant, who catalogued her work after her death, wrote that she seemed unsettled by reflection, often turning mirrors to the wall in her office. He kept a note found in her drawer that read, "It was not his ghost, only his echo." Meanwhile, construction workers continued to report disturbances in the fill, air pockets collapsing, soft hollows forming again weeks after being packed. One supervisor described the soil as breathing. Engineers dismissed it as moisture trapped beneath the clay cap. By 1915, the ground was stable enough for the new levee wall, and the last references to Cane Hollow disappeared from state correspondence. A field inspector named Robert Lyle, who oversaw the project's completion, mentioned in his journal that at dusk he saw what looked like a man and a boy by the waterline. Their backs turned. When he called out, neither moved. The next morning, only the imprints of boots and a small broom lay in the mud. Lyle wrote nothing more about it, but in his final report, he referred to that section of land as unfit for habitation. It remains listed that way in parish maps to this day, a blank patch of ground where nothing seems to root or last for long by the winter of 1916. Only a handful of families still lived within a mile of the old Cane Hollow tract. Most had moved after the river shifted course, and the land became prone to flooding. But a few lingered, fishermen, drifters, and one widow who kept a ledger of local births and deaths. Her name was Myra Bell, and she was said to have once worked as a housemaid on the Rone property decades earlier. When interviewed by a traveling journalist from the Times-Picayune, Myra described the place with unusual precision: the cracked veranda columns, the smell of sugar even years after the mill had fallen silent, and a shadow that didn't belong to any man living. She spoke of seeing lights along the levee, always moving eastward, always in pairs. One small, one tall. She said the locals called them the returning ones, the journalist dismissed. Her story, until she produced an item she claimed to have found after the last flood, is behind a brass pocket watch engraved with J.A.L. and the year, 1852. Inside was a folded scrap of paper bearing two phrases in the same faint hand. Second self-completed, and he does not know. The journalist turned the find over to the parish recorder, who logged it but never displayed it. When he revisited the record months later, both watch and note were gone, replaced by a single line in the inventory margin, "Returned to claimant." No claimant was listed. The year after that interview, Myra Bell disappeared. Her boat was found overturned in the bayou, her house looted, her journals missing. One neighbor swore he saw a man standing by the shore that same evening, dressed in a long coat and hat, staring toward the water. He said the man was pale, but his outline blurred in the mist, like something half-remembered. There was no investigation. The parish constable had resigned by then, and the files ended with an empty envelope marked Bell, Officer, unverified sighting. Researchers in the 1920s attempted to reconstruct the LaRue-Roane timeline for a historical anthology about Louisiana's forgotten plantations. One of them, Dr. Emery Falk, concluded that at least one man bearing the Rone name survived past 1900, possibly under an assumed identity. He compared property records between Iberville and Ascension parishes and noted recurring purchases of small plots under names similar in structure: J. A. Rone, J. Larone, J. L. Ains. He wrote, "If these were aliases, they were the work of someone determined to scatter himself." In one draft of his paper, Falk paraphrased Valcour Aimé's earlier reflection on the vanity of legacy, noting that Aimé's journals described men who saw immortality not in faith but in repetition. Falk's publisher removed that section, calling it speculation. Months later, Falk's office caught fire. The only surviving item from his collection was a charred label reading "Cane Hollow, do not refile." In 1921, long after the last official record of Cane Hollow had faded from state maps, the Louisiana Historical Society commissioned a small team to photograph sites of early sugar cultivation. Among them was a young archivist named Ruth Hollander, who later wrote in her field diary that she felt an unnatural stillness near the hollow grounds. Her report, found decades later in a library box mislabeled "Coastal Survey Notes," describes a morning heavy with fog, the land quiet except for insects. She noted traces of an old carriage road running parallel to the levee, its ruts still visible beneath weeds. Half a mile inland stood the remnants of the old farmhouse, the wall of a parlour, a collapsed chimney, and the faint shape of stairs leading nowhere. Hollander and her assistant took 6 photographs before the light dimmed. 5 developed normally. The 6th, showing the ruins from a distance, revealed something neither recalled seeing: 2 figures near the tree line. One tall, wearing what appeared to be a long coat, the other smaller, holding a broom or cane. She sent the plates to Baton Rouge for verification, but when the set was returned, that final negative was missing. The report simply noted damage to exposure. Hollander, skeptical but shaken, made a second visit weeks later. She wrote that the air around the property felt heavy, as if drawn inward. Near the levee she found shards of porcelain, the remains of a medicine bottle, and an ivory button identical to the one found years earlier inside the collapsed carriage. She boxed them for the state archive, yet none are listed in the current catalogue. During that same year, a farmer living 2 miles south of the site claimed he saw a light moving along the embankment for 3 consecutive nights. On the 4th, he followed it. His statement to the parish constable reads plainly, "The light came from a lantern held by a man in a fine coat, walking slow, like counting steps. When he reached the river bend, he put the lantern down and stood still." A second figure appeared beside him, smaller, same shape as before. Then both were gone. The constable recorded the testimony without comment, though he added a marginal note: "No footprints found. Soil too firm for flood season." That same year, a visiting historian from Tulane named Dr. Victor LeMay gave a lecture on Valcorame's influence on the sugar parishes. When asked about the LaRue affair, he reportedly replied, "If Amy's records taught us anything, it's that the fear of vanishing drives men to strange creation." He later added, "Some legacies rot slower than bone." His words drew little notice then, but his lecture transcript remains one of the few scholarly acknowledgments tying the LaRue myth to recorded plantation history. By 1923, Hollander had left the society, citing health and recurring dreams of water. She never returned to the site. In 1924, the state initiated another survey of abandoned plantation lands along the lower Mississippi, and Cane Hollow, now officially renamed only as Section 9, Parish Edge, was revisited by a trio of civil engineers. Their report, stored in the Baton Rouge archives, contains a peculiar side note. Beneath a list of soil measurements, one engineer, W.J. Corbin, wrote, "Observed remnant of brick wall with embedded iron hook. Wall appears recent. Tool marks too clean to date pre-war. No habitation was recorded within 5 miles, and yet the engineers found faint signs of recent activity: ashes, cut wood, and boot prints." Corbin described a faint odor of oil and smoke, as though a small fire had been tended in secret. When he returned to the site the following day, the ashes had been cleared, the ground tamped flat, and what looked like initials had been scrawled into the mud, J.R., before the night rain erased them. The team also discovered a half-buried wooden chest lined with wax cloth, its contents waterlogged but recognizable: fragments of parchment, a child's leather shoe, and a brass nameplate reading Roane. J.A. The chest was photographed, sealed, and sent to the parish office for cataloguing, but the crate was later reported missing during transfer. The driver who handled it filed a brief statement claiming that he heard a sound like tapping from inside, before the wagon overturned into the ditch. He abandoned the wreck and walked back to town. When the parish clerk dispatched men to recover the chest, nothing remained but a broken wheel and muddy ruts leading toward the riverbank. By autumn, interest in the site waned again. Flood recovery elsewhere drew the state's attention. Only a few regional newspapers printed brief notes about the Roane chest and haunted road, blending official record with rumor. One columnist speculated that the man once known as James LaRue had been buried upright to see his land forever, citing similar stories from other parishes. Another writer claimed that the Roane name still appeared in obscure property claims under slightly altered spellings, as though someone continued to sign for land long after the family had vanished. Parish clerks quietly confirmed that new applications bearing the initials JAR were filed every decade or so, always for small tracts near the river's curve. Never occupied for long, in 1925, an archivist revisiting Valcour Aimé's surviving journals noted how often he'd written of neighbors who refused to yield to nature. He drew a parallel between those entries and the LaRue affair, remarking that both men seemed to seek permanence through unnatural means. His final annotation ends with a faint warning. The river teaches men they are temporary, but some refuse to listen. Within a few years, another flood would sweep across the lower parishes, drowning whatever remained of Cane Hollow. When the waters receded, nothing but the highest ground near the old levee showed signs of life. An empty patch of field, a bent iron hook glinting in the sun. By 1927, the Great Mississippi Flood swallowed nearly every trace of the lower parishes, and Cane Hollow disappeared for good beneath the murky waters. But the flood also exposed what the soil had hidden for decades. In a government report stored under displacement data, Parish 14, an engineer recorded an unidentified anomaly unearthed near the river bend. A series of cedar coffers, each lined with glass, each containing what appeared to be personal effects, buttons, quills, pocket mirrors, and a single folded note preserved inside a sealed jar. The note was partially legible and read only, "Name continues. Keep soil damp." The coffers were taken to Baton Rouge for examination, but the warehouse storing them burned later that year, and the surviving list of recovered items ended mid-sentence. The flood had other witnesses. A Red Cross nurse named Clara Downs, stationed in Plaquemine, told a reporter that one night while tending evacuees, she saw a man standing in waist-deep water near the old levee, holding what looked like a lantern. She said, "He looked right through me. I thought he was one of ours until he turned and I saw his coat. It was the old kind, long and black, not soaked though he'd been in the water." Her account was dismissed as fatigue, but she insisted the figure turned and walked away from her. Deeper into the flood, carrying the light as if leading someone unseen, 2 other volunteers corroborated seeing a second, smaller shadow following. Official reports focused on disaster relief, not folklore, but one government map of the floodplain marks the area near Cane Hollow with a curious notation: ground shifts frequently, avoid excavation. Local men claimed that when the water receded, they found deep impressions in the silt that resembled footprints, one large, one small, leading toward the high ridge where the farmhouse once stood. There they found an iron cot, rusted through, and beside it a brass chain fused into the mud. A few years later, a journalist named Jerome Duval revisited the parish to document post-flood recovery. In his notes, he mentioned being shown a small wooden cross carved crudely with the letters CH, possibly for Cane Hollow or perhaps something else. The man who gave it to him, an elderly blacksmith named Henry Page, claimed it had washed up near his land along with bits of glass and an old ring that wouldn't stay buried. Page told Duval, "That place don't sink right. River takes it, river gives it back." He then refused to talk further. Duval's article never saw print, but fragments of his notes were later found in a university archive in New Orleans. The final sentence in his handwriting reads, "Still they are seen, the man and his likeness. One leading, one following, neither alive enough to rest." By 1929, the waters had receded enough for new settlers to consider rebuilding along the old levee line. A family named Broussard purchased a parcel of land that local surveyors identified as part of the former Cane Hollow tract. Within a month of moving in, they abandoned the property. The parish deed officer, when asked why, simply said, "They wouldn't stay the night after the third storm." Later accounts from neighbors described strange occurrences: the sound of a carriage wheel turning on gravel, though no road remained, the flicker of lamplight at the edge of the fields where no house stood. The eldest Broussard son, in a later affidavit, claimed he once woke to see a man standing on the ridge wearing a long coat, staring toward the house. He thought it a vagrant until he noticed the figure was dry despite the rain. Valcour Ames' journals were undergoing re-examination that same year at Tulane, and a historian named Dr. Alcott briefly revived interest in the LaRue affair. His research linked the Cane Hollow legend to broader patterns of inheritance obsession among antebellum planters. Ames' writings, he noted, reflected the slow decay of reason among men who confused lineage with salvation. Alcott mentioned a neighbor of Ames, a Mr. J. LaRue of Iberville, who had once boasted that death is only a change of tenant, The quote circulated in academic circles, fueling speculation that LaRue had staged his own demise to preserve his estate. Yet when Alcott requested parish ledgers for comparison, he found that every LaRue record after 1854 had been redacted or transferred under aliases like Roane, Rone, and Larone. The handwriting across decades remained eerily similar. In 1930, an amateur historian named Elsie Dupré compiled an oral history of the parishes and interviewed descendants of former plantation workers. One elderly man, identified only as Isaac, recounted stories passed down through his family. He said his grandfather once worked at Cane Hollow and described a night when the master returned from the river, thin and cold as paper, bringing with him a younger man who had his eyes, his way of standing. Isaac recalled the phrase exactly. Same man, new skin. Dupré's transcriptions, now held in microfilm, show her disbelief in the margins. Still, she noted that Isaac described the land accurately. The levee bend, the position of the farmhouse, the hollow sound of the soil when stepped upon. He told her, "They thought they buried him, but the river never keeps what don't belong." By 1932, the story had shifted from record to legend. School teachers used it to warn children away from the riverbank, calling it the planter's lesson. Older residents avoided the subject altogether. Some said that on misty mornings one could see two figures walking the edge of the water, the taller pausing every few yards as if to check that the smaller still followed. Others claimed that the ground near the former foundation never dried fully, that it always held a sheen like sweat no matter the season. The parish maps show the area as vacant land, yet survey photos from that year display a faint path cutting through the brush, straight, deliberate, ending abruptly at the river's bend. By 1933, researchers collecting data for the newly formed Historical Geographies Commission stumbled on a parcel record labeled Only Estate Disputed Lineage. The accompanying notes were minimal. Two names, Roane and LaRue, crossed through in alternating ink. A surveyor named Edwin Markham, responsible for documenting the region, later wrote in his field notebook that he found remnants of a boundary fence built far more recently than expected. The wood was new, the nails machine-made. Someone had been there after the flood. He followed the fence line until it curved toward the old river road, where he found two stones placed deliberately in the mud, one smooth, one roughly cut. He measured their distance, 3 feet apart, facing opposite directions. Markham took a photograph that same day. When the film developed, faint shadows appeared behind the stones, blurred human shapes that did not correspond to any living person in the frame. He destroyed the negative but kept the print, which was later found folded inside his personal journal. Across the back he wrote, "Two forms but only one light." That same year, the Louisiana Writers Project began collecting regional folklore. Among the submissions from Iberville Parish was a handwritten story titled The Heir of the River. It told of a planter who refused to die and of a man enslaved to carry his face, cursed to follow wherever he fled. The anonymous author claimed the story was based on records taken from the house of a sugar man long gone. Within the narrative appeared familiar names: Eleanor, Caleb, Montfort. The manuscript described the moment. The master returned as a day of mist when the river ran backward, and a second man came up from the mud. Scholars reviewing the collection later dismissed it as a local variant of Gothic folklore, though several phrases echoed language from county documents decades earlier. One historian remarked, "It reads like testimony disguised as parable." The last formal attempt to verify any of it came in 1935, when a geologist named Raymond Pike investigated soil displacement near the bend for a levee reinforcement project. His notes survive. Soil under former Cane Hollow site unusually porous, shifting as if hollow underneath. Detected residual lime and ash, consistent with burial treatment. Recommend no foundation placed here. Pike attached a rough sketch showing an oval depression roughly the size of a small cellar. He made one final comment in the margin. Found fragment of glass with trapped air bubble. Appears to contain reflection, but no source of image visible. He never published his findings. 2 months later, Pike drowned when his skiff capsized on a clear morning. Locals who found the wreck said his hands were clenched around a strip of waxcloth stamped with the letters JLR. The floodplain stabilized after that, but no one built on the spot. Old maps still label the section as restricted levee zone. Farmers pass by it without looking, saying it's where the river once took a man twice and returned him once. At dawn, the mist sometimes shapes itself into what they call the pair, a tall figure moving ahead and a smaller one behind, both walking until the light breaks. By 1936, only 2 names remained associated with the Cane Hollow region, one in parish tax ledgers, one in local folklore. The official record listed the land as owned by J. Larone, absentee, while the townspeople spoke of a figure they called the man who would not cross. That year, a WPA cartographer named Helen Duclair undertook to rechart the bayou channels and make sketches of notable ruins. She wrote in her journal that the ground near the old LaRue tract sank beneath each step, though dry above. While making her final drawing, she saw what she described as a carriage wheel just under the surface, perfectly preserved. She touched the rim with her cane. It crumbled instantly into black dust. Nearby, a single footprint appeared in the clay where no one else had walked. Helen noted its size, a large man's boot, and drew it carefully in her field notebook. That notebook survives. Now bound in the university's collection, its pages stained faintly brown from water exposure. The drawing shows another detail rarely mentioned, a faint shadow just behind the print, shaped like a smaller foot overlapping the first. Helen later told a colleague she'd felt watched that afternoon. The next day, she refused to revisit the site. By 1937, a farmer repairing fence posts half a mile downstream uncovered fragments of a mirror frame with initials carved in the back, JLR, and turned it over to the sheriff. The sheriff dismissed it as coincidence until, a week later, a laborer found a skull nearby with a single silver tooth. The coroner ruled it animal, though the record later shows the entry crossed out. That same autumn, the river rose again, sweeping away the exposed ground. Witnesses said the flood carried pieces of brick and glass that glinted even after sunset, drifting like lanterns. Parish elders claimed they'd seen such lights before, always in pairs, always heading east. Academic interest returned briefly when a historian re-examining Valcour Aimé's writings pointed out that one missing journal volume had been sold at auction in New Orleans in 1909 under an alias purchaser, JAR. The coincidence was striking but unprovable. The scholar wrote, "Perhaps the man who feared death learned to live within other names. Today the coordinates once marking Cane Hollow lie beneath a line of cypress and stagnant water. Surveyors say the land cannot hold foundation. Its soil shifts every season, as if something moves below. Locals seldom speak its name. They say that when the mist thickens, a carriage's silhouette still appears by the waterline, motionless at first, then turning slowly east. The taller figure sits straight, the smaller walks beside, and both fade when the sun touches the levee. The stories end as they began, in silence in Louisiana, where the river keeps its secrets, and every name eventually returns to the mud." By 1938, drought lowered the river enough for the parish surveyors to walk across the flats where Cane Hollow once lay. They found the earth split like old parchment, and within one fissure a remnant of iron, perhaps part of the carriage long whispered about. Parish clerk notes from that season mention a loop of chain fixed into root matter, uncorroded. When they pulled it free, a dark outline remained in the clay, the curve of a wheel, the edge of a boot, and what looked to some like the press of a hand. A photographer documented the find. His negative turned fog white at that frame. The surviving photos show only emptiness. He left the profession soon after. In the following months, itinerant workers camping near the bend reported a stranger visiting at night, asking directions to Iberville by the old road. They described him as tall, pale, courteous, and out of time. He wore a coat cut decades out of fashion and spoke with formality, calling himself James. One witness added, "He looked like the portraits they keep in the courthouse, eyes that don't blink." No one saw him leave. Only the shallow ruts of wheels appeared near the marsh 2 days later. Parish constables followed them to where the soil softened and lost all trace. They found a scrap of linen embroidered with the initials JLR and the faint smell of laudanum still clinging to it. The constable's report concluded simply, "Object placed, not dropped." That same year, a small historical exhibit in Baton Rouge displayed a daguerreotype labeled Roane family Iberville, 1850s. Visitors later claimed that the elder figure's eyes seemed to change in each exposure, sometimes grey, sometimes almost black, and that a faint double outline appeared behind him. The museum removed it after complaints that the image unnerved the staff. When archivists checked the accession file, the photograph had no recorded donor. By 1939, only aging farmers recalled the LaRue name, and even they confused it with others lost to flood and fever. Yet travelers stopping in the parish still heard the story from hired hands, that a planter once traded his death for lineage, and a servant bore his likeness until both were taken by the river. Those who pass by the bend at dusk say the air there feels heavy, as if watching. The cypress roots reach upward instead of down, and sometimes when the wind dies, the faint echo of hooves can be heard fading eastward, 2 sets, one steady, one struggling to keep pace. The locals say that's how you know you've reached what was once Cane Hollow. Where the river runs backward for those who can't let go of their names by 1940, the parish council had finally declared the bend a restricted zone, citing unstable terrain. No construction was permitted, no grazing allowed. The decree might have ended the story, if not for a report filed by a road maintenance worker named Ellis Grant. He wrote that on a foggy morning in March, he discovered wheel tracks leading from the highway directly into the flooded hollow. They were too narrow for any modern automobile. They looked, he said, like the kind my grandfather drew with his mule team. At the end of the tracks he found nothing but standing water. Yet when he turned to leave he heard a single creak, like a cart settling its weight. He walked faster, then ran. That night he dreamt of the same sound, followed by a voice whispering his own name twice. He never returned to that route. The Federal Works Progress Administration continued its survey of historic Louisiana properties that year and listed Cane Hollow as destroyed by flood. But one archivist, a woman named Marianne Locke, included a short note in the margin of her report. Locals insist 2 graves near the levee glow faintly after storms. No physical source found. Her supervisor struck the line before publication, labeling it folkloric excess. She later key. By 1943, the river's course had shifted again, sealing the hollow beneath silt and willow roots. Still, odd reports trickled in. A fisherman named Claude Heber filed a statement with the Plaquemine sheriff claiming he'd found a brass locket and the jaw of a small shovel in the mud near the bend. Inside, the locket was a miniature portrait of a man with sharp features and pale eyes, though the paint had begun to flake. The reverse side was inscribed simply, heirs of the soil. The sheriff logged the items and sent them to Baton Rouge, but the evidence locker burned that same month. The cause officially electrical. Claude later told friends he dreamt of standing in the same spot by the river, hearing a horse breathing behind him, yet seeing nothing when he turned. He moved inland the next year, refusing ever to fish again. The LaRue legend persisted quietly through those war years. Soldiers stationed near the levee said the nights there felt thicker. They would joke that the sound of hooves belonged to ghosts working the old cane fields, but more than one man refused night duty after claiming to see 2 shadows keeping pace with each other. The Corps of Engineers avoided the subject. In their files, Section 9 remained annotated unstable substrata. Avoid excavation. When an inspection team dug briefly in 1944 to test the soil, they unearthed a pair of rusted door hinges fused to a wooden beam. The report noted they were from a pre-war structure of fine craftsmanship, perhaps the remains of the farmhouse. The men who found it refused to carry the pieces. One wrote that the beam was warm to the touch despite the cold air. That same winter, the Baton Rouge Historical Review published a letter attributed to an unnamed Southern archivist who had studied Valcour Aimé's papers. The letter suggested that LaRue's obsession with continuity might have stemmed from an actual exchange of identity between master and servant, a transference enacted under the guise of inheritance. He wished to live beyond the body, the letter read, and so he placed himself in another. The journal's editors dismissed it as speculation and retracted the piece, but a proof copy survived, bearing an underlined phrase in blue pencil. Blood was not the measure. Likeness was. In the same archive box, a later researcher found a clipping from 1867, a brief obituary for a man named Caleb Rone, no family listed. Cause of death unknown, wasting. The decades that followed buried Cane Hollow once more under silt and memory. The land became part of the floodplain preserve. Yet people along the levee still tell the story. They say that on cold mornings, when the fog lifts from the river, you can hear a cartwheel groaning and the soft murmur of two voices, one commanding, one answering in the same tone. The locals call it the long echo. They say it doesn't matter which man speaks first, because both end the same way, calling the same name. By 1945, as the war's end brought soldiers home and the old parishes filled again with movement, the Cane Hollow story reappeared in quiet ways. A journalist from the State Times, researching post-war resettlement, recorded a brief interview with an elderly ferryman named Jules Morin, who claimed to have known the last Roane. He said the man lived alone in a small shack upriver, a recluse who spoke little and counted everything. According to Jules, the man owned no mirror, yet kept a single portrait on his wall, an old daguerreotype showing a younger version of himself. When the journalist asked to see it, Jules said the house had already been swallowed by the spring flood. Nothing remained but the iron stove and a chair facing the water. He remembered one thing clearly. The man had spoken of his father's promise, that he would return when the river changed direction. The journalist dismissed the account but printed a footnote describing the old ferry route near Iberville, where the water still bent strangely inward, creating a circular current. That same summer, parish workers building a drainage trench near that site unearthed what appeared to be a carved wooden cane handle shaped like an eye within a stalk of sugar. It was catalogued and sent to the State Museum, but lost in transfer. The work crew refused to continue excavating. The foreman said they heard tapping under the soil, as if wood knocked on wood from below. Heavily yellowed letters in the museum's correspondence file show that around this time, a local historian again mentioned Valcourt Aimé, drawing a parallel between his philanthropic records and LaRue's obsession with perpetuity. Aimé left monuments, he wrote, but LaRue tried to become one. That observation would be the last time the LaRue name appeared in print until the 1960s, when folklorists revived it in a book of plantation ghost stories. In that retelling, LaRue and his enslaved counterpart became one being split by guilt, cursed to trade faces with each century. The details were wrong, the names altered, yet the setting, Louisiana, the river bend, the light moving east, remained the same. Old maps from the Corps of Engineers dated 1948 still mark a circular depression where Cane Hollow once stood. The notation reads, "Unresolved sink activity." Pilots flying low over the river have since reported that the patch glimmers briefly under certain light, as if the ground reflects. Locals say that if you approach it by boat before sunrise, the water still bears faint rings, two circles side by side, each turning in opposite directions. The fishermen who've seen it refuse to cast lines there. They say the air feels occupied, as though someone else is waiting to rise. Some swear they've heard a man call out from the fog, then another voice answering in the same pitch, the same tone, like an echo speaking first. By 1949, the last official mention of Cane Hollow appeared in a state hydrology report, a single line noting localized current reversal during spring runoff. No further explanation followed, yet those who lived along the bend continued to mark the place with quiet reverence, leaving small tokens, coins, bits of rope, a child's toy horse beside the water. They said it was an old habit inherited from those who feared the river would take more than soil. One fisherman, now long dead, once told a young reporter, "That ground's got memory. Step wrong, and it remembers you back." The legend found new life that same year, when a Tulane archivist uncovered correspondence between parish officials from the 1850s and a plantation doctor named Montfort. The letters hinted at an arrangement of substitution between a master and his servant, the language clinical and precise. Nowhere did they name LaRue, but the initials matched, JAL. The discovery was quietly suppressed after the archivist reported hearing voices while cataloguing the documents, two men arguing in tones too faint to place. Her supervisor dismissed it as exhaustion. The letters were later misplaced, the file reclassified under duplicate holdings. In an oral interview recorded in 1950, The last surviving field hand born on the old estate, a man called Samuel Kane, recalled what his father had told him, that Mr. James never died, only changed his reflection. Samuel described a recurring dream where he stood on the levee at dawn and saw two men by the carriage, one older, one younger, their faces shifting like mirrored glass. The one on the seat looked ahead, he said, and the one behind looked at me, but both had the same eyes. When asked what the dream meant, he said, "It means they never stopped walking." The recording ends with static and what sounds faintly like water lapping against wood. By the mid-century surveys, the land had swallowed itself again. The foundations sank. No official road now leads there. Maps show only a bend of cypress and the widening of the Mississippi. At night, tugboat captains still report a pale gleam on the water's surface where the old road would have crossed. It drifts eastward, as though following a route only the river remembers. Scholars looking for closure find none. Every few years, someone rediscovers a fragment, a button, a ledger page, an ivory token, and with it comes the same chill. The same whisper of two names that were always one. So ends the file. No verdict. No graves, only water, and the uneasy echo of those who sought to outlive their end. Even now, when the wind turns along the Louisiana bend, it carries the sound of wheels and a faint voice repeating itself into the fog, unwilling to fade, rehearsing the name that never truly died.